The message from Captain Lisa Morgan reached Earth 3 days later and caused immediate chaos in the halls of human government. Admiral Grace Turner was in a budget meeting when her aide rushed in with the emergency transmission, and Grace knew from the young man's face that something terrible had happened. She dismissed the other officials and locked her office door before playing the recording that would change everything. Grace had been in the military for 30 years and had seen many horrible things during humanity's expansion into space, but nothing had prepared her for what she heard in that asteroid-based transmission. She played the message 3 times before calling an emergency meeting of Earth's High Command, and each time she listened, her anger grew stronger. Helen Kane arrived at the emergency session within an hour of Grace's call. Helen ran the Xenological Protection Agency, which was supposed to help alien species that humans encountered, but Helen had never dealt with anything like this before. She brought with her a team of experts who could translate the alien languages, better than Captain Morgan's crew had managed. The improved translations made the situation even worse than Grace had first thought. Helen's team had managed to clean up more of the audio and had found additional messages hidden in the static. These new recordings contained testimonies from females who had escaped from Dominion slave camps, and their stories made even the most experienced military officers feel sick. Major Sophia Blake was called in to represent the Special Operations Division, and she listened to the recordings with the cold focus of someone who had spent years fighting humanity's enemies. Sophia was known for being tough and practical, but even she had to leave the room twice during the briefing to compose herself. The recordings revealed that the Dominion had captured females from dozens of different species over several years. The aliens seemed to specifically target settlements where females lived peacefully and had no strong military defenses. They would kill the males quickly, but would take great care to capture the females alive and unharmed at first. Dr. Claire Fox was the military's top expert on alien psychology, and she explained to the assembled officers what the Dominion was really doing. Claire had studied the behavior of many hostile alien species, but she said the Dominion's methods were unlike anything she had seen before. They were not just taking slaves, but were trying to destroy entire cultures by breaking the spirits of their females. The Dominion would separate captured females from their families and friends, and then use a combination of physical and mental torture to make them forget who they had been before. Claire explained that many species in the galaxy were organized around strong female leaders, and by destroying these leaders, the Dominion could control entire planets without having to fight long wars. Grace listened to all of this information and felt something awakening inside her that she had not experienced since humanity's early wars. It was not just anger at an enemy, but something deeper and more dangerous. She looked around the room and saw the same feeling growing in the faces of every human present. The meeting was interrupted when news of the alien distress call began to spread beyond the military command. Someone had leaked parts of the recording to the civilian media, and within hours, every human settlement in the galaxy was hearing about the suffering females trapped in Dominion slave camps. Grace watched the news reports with amazement as something unprecedented began to happen across human space. Civilians who had never shown interest in military service were lining up at recruitment offices demanding to be allowed to join rescue missions. Factories that had been producing civilian goods suddenly announced they were switching to military production without being asked by the government. The reaction was strongest among human females, but males were responding almost as intensely. Grace received reports that some human colonies were sending their entire adult populations to volunteer for military service while leaving only essential personnel behind. It was as if some ancient instinct had been triggered in the human species. Dr. Claire Fox tried to explain to Grace what was happening, but even she seemed surprised by the intensity of the response. Claire said that humans had evolved as a species that protected their own females and children above all else, and that this instinct was now being directed toward the suffering alien females. The fact that the victims were female and helpless had activated something in human nature that was older than civilization. The response grew stronger when more details about the Dominion's methods became public. Helen Kane's team had found evidence that the aliens were using techniques specifically designed to cause maximum psychological damage to female prisoners. They were not just enslaving these creatures, but were trying to destroy everything that made them individuals. Major Sophia Blake presented a preliminary rescue plan to Grace, but both women knew that the situation required much more than a simple military operation. The Dominion controlled hundreds of star systems and had been building their slave empire for decades. A few rescue missions would barely make a difference to the thousands of females suffering in their camps. Grace made a decision that would reshape human society for generations to come. She declared a state of total war against the Dominion and announced that humanity would not rest until every enslaved female had been freed and every Dominion leader had been brought to justice. The declaration was broadcast to every human world, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, human shipyards that had been building exploration vessels and trading ships were retooling to produce warships. Human colonies that had focused on farming and mining were organizing supply lines to support military operations. The entire human economy was shifting toward a single goal, and that goal was the complete destruction of the Dominion. The most remarkable part of the transformation was how voluntary it all was. Grace had expected to need emergency powers to mobilize human society for war, but instead she found that humans everywhere were demanding to be allowed to contribute to the fight. Parents were sending their children to military academies, and elderly civilians were volunteering to work in weapons factories. Grace received a message from Captain Lisa Morgan reporting that the Meridian had reached the asteroid base and had made contact with the survivors. Lisa confirmed that the situation was exactly as bad as the recordings had suggested, and that immediate military intervention was needed to prevent a massacre. The survivors included females from 12 different species, and many of them were injured both physically and mentally from their experiences in Dominion camps. Lisa reported that some of the rescued females were so traumatized that they could barely speak, but that the elf leader Liralai and the Zephyrian scientist Zara were working to keep the group organized and hopeful. Grace authorized the immediate deployment of the 7th Fleet to provide support for the rescue operation, but she knew that this was only the beginning. The message from that distant asteroid had awakened something in humanity that had been sleeping since their species had become civilized and peaceful. The Dominion had made the mistake of targeting helpless females for torture and enslavement, and now they would face the consequences of that choice. As Grace prepared for the largest military mobilization in human history, she thought about the scared voices in that original distress call. Those females had asked for help, and humanity was going to give them more help than they had ever imagined possible. The Dominion was about to learn why it was a very bad idea to make humans angry. 3 weeks after Admiral Grace Turner's declaration of war, the transformation of human society was complete in ways that amazed even military planners. Michelle Ross stood in the main assembly hall of the Titan shipyards, watching hundreds of workers complete another warship ahead of schedule, and she still could not believe what was happening around her. Michelle had been designing civilian spacecraft for 15 years, but now she was leading the largest military construction project in human history. The shipyards that had been building maybe one exploration vessel per month were now completing 3 warships every week, and the pace was still increasing. The workers had volunteered for double shifts without being asked, and many of them were civilians who had learned shipbuilding skills in just days. Michelle watched a grandmother who had been a schoolteacher 2 weeks ago welding hull plates, with the skill of someone who had been doing the job for years. The woman's granddaughter was working beside her installing weapons systems, and both of them had the same determined expression on their faces. The ships being built were not the elegant exploration vessels that humans had been making for peaceful purposes. These were warships with names like Righteous Fury and Protector's Wrath and Guardian's Vengeance, and they were designed for one purpose only. Every weapon system was focused on maximum firepower, and every defensive system was built to keep the ship fighting until every enemy was destroyed. Colonel Dana Walsh arrived at the shipyard to inspect the latest completed vessels, and Michelle showed her around the new production lines. Dana was going to command the 7th Liberation Fleet, and she wanted to understand exactly what kind of ships she would be taking into battle against the Dominion. Dana had been a career military officer, but even she was impressed by what the civilian shipbuilders had accomplished. The new warships were larger and more heavily armed than anything humans had built before, but they also had one feature that made them unique. Every ship had expanded medical facilities and holding areas designed specifically for rescued prisoners. Michelle explained to Dana that every human ship was being built with the assumption that it would be rescuing traumatized females from Dominion slave camps. The medical bays were equipped to handle both physical injuries and psychological trauma, and the holding areas were designed to make rescued prisoners feel safe, rather than like they were still captives. The most impressive feature was the communication systems that had been installed in every ship. Human linguists and computer experts had worked together to create translation programs that could handle dozens of alien languages, including the Elvish dialects and Zephyrian technical vocabulary. Every human soldier would be able to communicate with rescued prisoners and reassure them that they were truly safe. Dana inspected the first completed ships and found that they exceeded every specification that the military had requested. The civilian workers had added improvements that military engineers had not even thought of, and had done it all without being ordered or even asked. The ships were ready for war, but they were also ready to heal the wounds that war had created. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Stone joined Dana and Michelle as they toured the weapons testing facilities where the new ship armaments were being calibrated. Rachel was going to lead the covert operations that would establish contact with resistance groups in Dominion space, and she needed to understand what kind of support her teams would have. The weapons being installed on the human ships were designed with very specific goals in mind. They could destroy Dominion military targets with precision while leaving civilian areas intact, and they were optimized for battles where human ships needed to protect rescued prisoners while still fighting effectively. Every weapon system could be controlled to minimize collateral damage while maximizing destruction of enemy forces. Rachel had been studying intelligence reports about Dominion territories, and she was amazed by how much information was suddenly available. Resistance groups from dozens of species were making contact with human forces and offering to help with rescue operations. The news that humans were mobilizing to free enslaved females had spread across the galaxy, and oppressed peoples everywhere were volunteering to assist. The most valuable intelligence was coming from the survivors that Captain Lisa Morgan had rescued from the asteroid base. Lyra Leigh Starweaver and her fellow elves were providing detailed information about Dominion military installations, while Zara Vex and the other Zephyrians were sharing technical knowledge that helped human engineers improve their weapons and defenses. Lyra Leigh had been brought to Earth to work with human military planners, and her presence had an immediate impact on everyone who met her. The elf woman had been a noble leader before her people were attacked, and she carried herself with dignity despite everything she had suffered. When she spoke about the friends she had lost, and the females still trapped in Dominion camps, human soldiers listened with anger that grew stronger every day. Zara Vex was working with human scientists to develop new technologies that combined human engineering with Zephyrian energy manipulation techniques. The alien woman had lost her entire family to Dominion slavers, but she focused her grief into helping humans become more effective at destroying their common enemy. Dinah received reports that similar scenes were happening at military bases across human space. Volunteers were training for ground combat operations, while others learned how to operate the psychological support systems that would be needed to help rescued prisoners recover from their trauma. Every human seemed to understand that winning battles would not be enough if they could not also heal the damage that had been done. The Dominion leadership had initially dismissed humans as a minor spacefaring species that posed no real threat to their empire. Intelligence reports indicated that Dominion commanders were confused by the scale and speed of human mobilization, and were having difficulty understanding why humans cared so much about the fate of alien females. This confusion was about to become a major tactical disadvantage for the Dominion, because they had no experience fighting an enemy that prioritized rescuing prisoners over conquering territory. Human military doctrine was being rewritten around strategies that would free captives even if it meant accepting higher casualties or longer campaigns. Dana watched as the first ships of her liberation fleet prepared for departure, and she felt a pride that was different from anything she had experienced in her military career. These ships represented more than just human military power, and they represented humanity's commitment to protecting innocence wherever they found it. The departure ceremony was attended by thousands of civilians who had worked to build the ships, and many of them were crying as they watched the fleet leave for its first mission. Dana knew that every human in the galaxy would be watching the results of this operation, and that success would mean more than just military victory. Michelle returned to the shipyards as soon as the ceremony ended, because there were more ships to build and more weapons to install. The first liberation fleet was just the beginning, and human industrial capacity was still growing every day. The Dominion had started a war by choosing to torture helpless females, and now they were going to face the full power of an angry human species. Rachel departed with advanced teams that would prepare the way for the main fleet operations. Her job was to make contact with underground resistance groups and establish safe zones where rescued prisoners could be protected and treated. She carried with her translation equipment and medical supplies that would allow small human teams to provide immediate assistance to any females they encountered. As the ships disappeared into hyperspace, Dana thought about the voices in that original distress call that had started everything. Those scared alien females had asked for help, and now they were going to get more help than any of them had imagined possible. The human war machine was fully awake and moving toward Dominion space with unstoppable momentum. Captain Megan Price stood on the bridge of the Liberation ship Guardian's Promise as it approached the first Dominion slave camp that human forces had ever attacked. Megan had volunteered for this mission, knowing that it would be dangerous, but she had not expected to feel so nervous about what they might find when they reached their target. The intelligence reports from Lyralay and Zara had described the layout of the camp and the number of guards, but no amount of preparation could really ready someone for seeing systematic cruelty in person. Megan knew that her crew was as ready as they could be, but she also knew that this mission would test everyone in ways that normal combat never did. The Dominion had built their slave camps to be difficult to attack without harming the prisoners inside, and Megan's tactical team had spent weeks planning an assault that would neutralize the guards while keeping the enslaved females safe. The plan required perfect timing and coordination, but Megan trusted her people to execute it flawlessly. Lieutenant Sarah Kim was commanding the Marine assault teams that would secure the camp once the initial attack was complete. Sarah had trained specifically for rescue operations, and her Marines were equipped with non-lethal weapons that could subdue guards without risking injury to nearby prisoners. Every Marine also carried medical supplies and trauma counseling equipment. The attack began at dawn and proceeded exactly as planned until Megan's forces reached the actual prisoner barracks. Nothing that Lyralay and Zara had told them prepared the human soldiers for the reality of what they found inside those buildings. Megan had to order several of her Marines to leave the area because they were too angry to think clearly. The enslaved females were from at least 6 different species, and many of them were barely alive. The Dominion guards had been using starvation and medical neglect as tools of control, and some of the prisoners were too weak to stand when the Marines arrived. Worse than the physical condition was the psychological damage that was visible in their eyes. Sarah organized her teams to begin immediate medical treatment while other Marines secured the area and searched for additional prisoners. The rescued females were terrified of their rescuers at first because they had learned not to trust anyone who carried weapons. It took hours of patient work by human medical staff to convince them that they were truly safe. The most heartbreaking discovery was a group of young elf females who had been separated from the adult prisoners and subjected to special psychological conditioning. These girls had been told repeatedly that their families were dead and that no one would ever come to rescue them. When they saw Sarah's Marines, many of them tried to hide because they thought they were being moved to an even worse location. Megan watched her medical officer, Dr. Linda Wright, work with the traumatized prisoners and felt her own anger growing stronger with every hour. Linda was a gentle woman who had specialized in helping people recover from terrible experiences, but even she had difficulty maintaining her professional composure when faced with what the Dominion had done. The camp's records revealed information that made Megan immediately contact Admiral Grace Turner with an urgent request for additional forces. This single camp was part of a network of dozens of similar facilities, and the total number of enslaved females was far larger than human intelligence had estimated. The Dominion had been building their slave empire for decades and had perfected their methods of breaking the spirits of their captives. Grace responded to Megan's report by authorizing the immediate deployment of 10 additional liberation fleets and declaring that human forces would attack every known Dominion facility simultaneously. The news of what Megan's team had found at the first camp was broadcast to every human world, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Brigadier General Victoria Hart was put in charge of coordinating the massive humanitarian operation that would be needed to care for all the rescued prisoners. Victoria had experience with refugee operations, but nothing on the scale that was now required. Every human medical facility was being converted to handle alien patients, and volunteer doctors were arriving from across human space. The liberation of the first camp had an unexpected effect on other species in the galaxy because news of the rescue spread faster than human forces could advance. Resistance groups that had been hiding from Dominion forces for years suddenly began launching their own attacks, and many of them specifically requested human assistance. The sight of human soldiers treating rescued elf maidens and alien females with gentleness and respect while showing no mercy to their former captors was changing how other species viewed humanity. Videos of human Marines sharing their own food with starving prisoners and human doctors working around the clock to heal traumatized victims were being broadcast across the galaxy. Lyra Leigh Starweaver had initially been skeptical about human motives when she first met Captain Lisa Morgan, but her opinion changed completely when she witnessed human behavior during the rescue operations. She watched human soldiers choose to sacrifice themselves rather than leave wounded elves behind and realized that humanity's protective instincts were genuine and not just propaganda. The elf noble became humanity's most vocal advocate among the galaxy's free species, and her testimony about human character helped convince other governments to support the liberation campaign. Lyra Leigh's own people had suffered terribly under Dominion rule, but she told anyone who would listen that humans were different from every other species she had encountered. Zara Vex organized the rescued Zephyrians into engineering corps that worked alongside human technical teams to improve weapons and defenses. The alien woman had lost her entire family to Dominion slavers, but she found purpose in helping humans become more effective at destroying their common enemy. Her people's advanced energy manipulation techniques gave human ships significant advantages in combat. Commander Beth Martinez developed what became known as the Total Liberation Protocol after studying the results of the first dozen rescue operations. Beth realized that simply freeing prisoners was not enough because many of them had no homes to return to after years of Dominion occupation. The protocol ensured that every liberated world was left with functioning infrastructure and government. The protocol also required that Dominion military assets be completely eliminated, while civilian populations were left unharmed. Human forces began demonstrating that they could be completely ruthless to enemies while being completely protective of innocents, and this combination was unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. The Dominion leadership finally began to understand that they were facing an enemy unlike any they had fought before when human fleets started appearing in impossible numbers, using tactics that prioritized rescuing captives over territorial conquest. Dominion commanders had no experience dealing with opponents who would accept heavy casualties to save the lives of prisoners. Captain Megan Price led 3 more rescue operations over the following months, and each one was more successful than the last as human tactics improved and word spread among prisoner populations that help was coming. The rescued females began to believe that they might actually survive their ordeal, and this hope helped them cooperate with their rescuers. The most significant change was in how the rescued prisoners viewed their human liberators. Women who had given up all hope began to smile again when they saw human medical personnel approaching. Children who had forgotten what kindness looked like began to trust the gentle voices of human soldiers who promised that they were safe. Megan received a message from one of the first elf females that her team had rescued, and the content made her cry with happiness. The young woman had recovered enough to write a thank you letter in broken human language, and she wanted Megan to know that she was going to name her first daughter after the human captain who had saved her life. As human liberation fleets continued their advance through Dominion space, the galaxy watched in amazement at what they were accomplishing. Humanity had become the galaxy's primary protective force, not through conquest, but through their absolute refusal to abandon any innocent victim to suffering and their willingness to sacrifice everything to keep their promise that help was coming. Admiral Nina Cross received the intelligence report that would change the course of the war while she was reviewing casualty lists from the latest liberation operations. The report came from a rescued Zephyrian engineer who had managed to steal technical data during her escape from the Dominion's primary slave processing facility, and the information made Nina's blood run cold. The facility was called the Central Processing Station, and it was a massive space station that orbited a dead world in the heart of Dominion space. The station held over 1 million captives from dozens of species and served as the main distribution center for the Dominion's entire slave empire. Every enslaved female that human forces had rescued had passed through that station at some point. The intelligence data revealed that the station was where the Dominion conducted their most brutal psychological conditioning programs and where they held their most valuable prisoners. The report specifically mentioned that Queen Seraphina Goldleaf of the elf homeworld was being held there along with the entire Zephyrian diplomatic council that had been captured 3 years earlier. Nina studied the technical specifications of the station and realized that attacking it would require the largest military operation in human history. The facility was protected by hundreds of warships and had defensive systems that could destroy entire fleets. More importantly, any direct assault would put the million captives at risk, and Nina knew that humanity would never accept a rescue operation that resulted in massive prisoner casualties. The report also contained information that made the mission even more urgent than Nina had initially realized. The Dominion leadership had decided that their slave empire was becoming too expensive to maintain while fighting the human liberation forces, and they were planning to eliminate most of their captives rather than continue feeding and housing them. Nina called an emergency meeting with Admiral Grace Turner and the other top human commanders to plan what everyone knew would be the final battle of the war. The meeting lasted for 2 days as military planners tried to develop a strategy that could succeed against impossible odds while still protecting every innocent life on the station. Captain Joyce Wells volunteered to lead the boarding operations that would be needed to secure the station once the initial assault succeeded. Joyce had commanded more rescue missions than any other human officer, and she understood better than anyone how to fight inside facilities filled with terrified prisoners. Her teams would need to neutralize thousands of guards while reassuring millions of captives that they were being rescued. The battle plan that emerged from the planning sessions was unlike anything that had ever been attempted in the history of warfare. Human forces would attack the station from multiple directions, while simultaneously broadcasting surrender demands in dozens of languages to give Dominion forces a chance to save themselves by abandoning their posts. Laura Kim was put in charge of coordinating the evacuation of rescued prisoners, and she had to solve logistical problems that seemed impossible. Moving over 1 million traumatized individuals from a hostile space station to safety would require hundreds of ships and thousands of medical personnel. Laura worked with civilian volunteers to organize the largest humanitarian operation ever attempted. The assault began when Nina's fleet emerged from hyperspace and immediately came under heavy fire from the station's defensive systems. The human ships had been designed to absorb massive damage while protecting their crews, and they pressed forward, despite losing dozens of vessels in the first few minutes of combat. Nina watched from her command ship as human vessels formed protective formations around the station to prevent Dominion forces from escaping or calling for reinforcements. The sight of hundreds of human warships willingly absorbing enemy fire to protect imprisoned civilians was broadcast across the galaxy and changed how every species viewed humanity. The boarding operations began when Joyce's teams used specially designed assault shuttles to breach the station's hull and establish footholds inside the massive structure. Joyce led her Marines through corridors filled with automated defenses, while trying to reach the prisoner areas before Dominion guards could harm their captives. The fighting inside the station was unlike anything Joyce had experienced because her teams had to be careful not to damage life support systems or accidentally harm prisoners. The Marines used non-lethal weapons whenever possible and took enormous risks to avoid collateral damage. Many human soldiers died because they chose to expose themselves to enemy fire rather than risk harming innocent bystanders. Joyce's teams discovered that the station was even worse than the intelligence reports had indicated. The Dominion had been conducting medical experiments on some prisoners and had been using others for psychological research. The conditions in the deepest levels of the station were so horrible that some of Joyce's Marines had to be relieved from duty because they could not function after seeing what they found. The turning point in the battle came when Joyce's teams reached the section where Queen Seraphina and the other high-value prisoners were being held. The Elf Queen had been tortured for months, but she had never broken, and when she saw human soldiers approaching her cell, she immediately began organizing the other prisoners to assist with the evacuation. Queen Seraphina's presence transformed the rescue operation because she was able to communicate with prisoners from many different species and convince them that the humans were truly there to help them. Her authority and dignity gave hope to captives who had given up all belief that rescue was possible. The battle reached its climax when the Dominion Emperor realized that his forces were losing and decided to destroy the entire station rather than allow the prisoners to be freed. The Emperor activated a weapon system that would overload the station's power core and kill everyone aboard, including his own remaining forces. Nina faced the most difficult decision of her career when her sensors detected the Emperor's weapon charging up. She could order her fleet to retreat and save human lives, or she could try to shield the station and accept that thousands of her people would die in the explosion. Nina made her choice without hesitation. Every human ship in the fleet moved to form a protective barrier around the station as the Emperor's weapon fired. The explosion destroyed dozens of human vessels and killed thousands of crew members, but it did not reach the station where the prisoners were waiting for evacuation. Nina watched her friends die to save the lives of aliens they had never met, and felt proud of what humanity had become. The Emperor's final act of spite failed completely, and only served to demonstrate the difference between his species and humanity. The Dominion had chosen to destroy rather than accept defeat, while humans had chosen to sacrifice themselves to protect innocence. The galaxy watched this moment and understood that humanity was unlike any species they had encountered before. The evacuation took 3 weeks to complete, but every single prisoner was successfully rescued and transported to safety. Queen Seraphina worked alongside human medical personnel to help the most traumatized captives begin their recovery, and her presence reassured many prisoners that their nightmare was truly over. Laura Kim coordinated the distribution of rescued prisoners to temporary facilities where they could receive medical treatment and psychological counseling. Many of the captives had no homes to return to after years of Dominion occupation, but human colonies volunteered to provide permanent homes for anyone who needed them. The war officially ended when the last Dominion military facility surrendered and Admiral Grace Turner accepted the formal capitulation of the Emperor's surviving commanders. Grace announced that humanity would not seek territorial expansion or reparations, but would instead focus on helping the liberated species rebuild their societies. Queen Seraphina requested a formal meeting with the human leadership, and when she met with Grace, she made an offer that surprised everyone present. The Elf Queen asked humanity to accept the role of galactic guardians and promised that her people would support human efforts to prevent future atrocities from occurring anywhere in the galaxy. The Zephyrian Council made a similar request, and soon representatives from dozens of species were asking humanity to take responsibility for protecting the galaxy's innocent populations. Grace accepted these requests on behalf of humanity, but made it clear that humans would serve as protectors rather than rulers. The final scene of the Great War took place in a reconstruction colony, where human children played alongside young elves and alien children, while their parents worked together to build schools and hospitals. Grace watched the children playing, and realized that humanity had gained something more valuable than military victory by choosing to fight for others rather than for themselves. The memorial service for the humans who had died in the final battle was attended by millions of grateful aliens, including many of the prisoners who had been saved by their sacrifice. Queen Seraphina spoke for all of them when she promised that the galaxy would never forget what humanity had done and would always remember that there were people willing to die to protect innocence wherever it was threatened. Captain Lisa Morgan sat in her command chair aboard the exploration ship Meridian when the strange signal came through. The ship had been mapping star systems in the outer rim for 3 months now, and Lisa was getting tired of empty space and quiet days. Her crew was small, but good at their jobs, and they had found several new planets that might be good for human colonies someday. Kate Phillips was working at the communications station when she suddenly sat up straight and called out to Lisa. Kate had been with the crew for 2 years, and Lisa had never seen her look so worried before. The young woman's hands were shaking as she tried to clean up the signal that was coming through their receivers. The message was broken and full of static, but Lisa could hear voices speaking in languages she did not know. Kate worked on the signal for several minutes while Lisa and the rest of the crew waited. When Kate finally got the message clear enough to understand, Lisa felt her blood turn cold. The voices belonged to females, but they were not human. Some sounded like the elves that humans had met in other parts of the galaxy, and others sounded like they came from species that Lisa had never heard before. All of them were scared, and many were crying as they begged for help. Amy Brooks was the ship's military advisor, and she came to stand beside Lisa as they listened to the terrible message. Amy had fought in several wars before joining the exploration service, and Lisa trusted her judgment about dangerous situations. Amy's face grew dark as they heard more of the distress call. The message told a story that made Lisa's hands clench into fists. The females on the transmission said they were from peaceful settlements on a planet called Ethermoor, and from mining colonies near a place called Titan's Edge. They had been living quietly and bothering no one when ships from something called the Dominion had attacked without warning. Kate managed to translate parts of the message using the ship's computer systems. The translation was not perfect, but it was good enough to understand what had happened. The Dominion forces had destroyed entire cities and captured thousands of females from different species. The attackers had killed most of the males and taken the females away to be slaves. The part of the message that made Lisa most angry was when they learned what the Dominion was doing to their prisoners. The survivors who were still free had managed to rescue some of the captured females, and these poor creatures told horrible stories. The Dominion was not just using them as workers, but was trying to break their spirits completely before selling them as slaves to other worlds. Amy studied the technical data that came with the message, and her face became even more serious. She told Lisa that the Dominion was using methods that were designed specifically to destroy the minds of female prisoners. They were not just cruel, but were being cruel in ways that would make the females give up all hope of ever being free again. Lisa ordered Kate to trace where the signal was coming from, while Amy analyzed the military information in the message. It took Kate almost an hour, but she finally found that the transmission was coming from a hidden base built inside a large asteroid. The base was small and probably did not have many people, but it was the last safe place for the survivors. The message continued to play, and Lisa heard two voices that seemed to be the leaders of the survivors. One was an elf female who called herself Lyrelay Starweaver, and she spoke with the authority of someone who had been a warrior before becoming a refugee. The other was from an alien species that called themselves Zephyrians, and her name was Zara Vex, and she seemed to be some kind of scientist or engineer. Lyrelay and Zara took turns explaining their situation to whoever might be listening. They had managed to save about 300 females from different species, but their defenses were failing. The Dominion had found their hiding place and was sending ships to capture the last free survivors. They estimated that they had maybe 2 weeks before the enemy arrived in enough force to overrun their small base. The worst part of the message was when Lyrelay described what she had seen in the Dominion slave camps before she escaped. She spoke in a voice that was trying to stay calm, but Lisa could hear the pain behind her words. The elf woman told of seeing proud female warriors reduced to broken shells of themselves, and of young females who had given up all hope of ever seeing their homes again. Zara added technical details about the Dominion's methods that made Amy curse quietly beside Lisa. The aliens were not just taking slaves, but were trying to create a system where captured females would eventually help them capture more of their own kind. They were breaking down everything that made these creatures who they were and rebuilding them to serve the Dominion's goals. Lisa looked around at her crew and saw the same anger in their faces that she felt in her own heart. Kate was crying quietly as she continued to monitor the signal, and even the usually calm Amy looked like she wanted to hit something. The ship's doctor, Nancy Hill, had come to the bridge when she heard about the message, and her face was white with rage. The signal began to fade as Lisa made her decision. She ordered Kate to send a response to the asteroid base telling the survivors that help was coming. Then she told Amy to plot a course that would get them to the Kepler 442 system as fast as possible. The Meridian was not a warship, but Lisa did not care about that right now. Amy warned Lisa that their small exploration ship could not fight the Dominion forces alone, but Lisa was already thinking bigger than just one rescue mission. She ordered Kate to send a copy of the entire message back to Earth, along with a request for immediate military support. Lisa knew that when the people of Earth heard what was happening to these helpless females, there would be consequences that the Dominion had not planned for. As the Meridian changed course toward the distant star system, Lisa listened to the message one more time. She made a promise to herself and to the scared voices on the transmission that humanity would not let these crimes continue. The Dominion had made a terrible mistake when they decided to torture and enslave innocent females, and Lisa intended to make sure they paid for that mistake.